All right, welcome back to another Michael Volpe Investigates special report. I'm here with Jonathan Farley, and you and I are going to talk about a horrible situation that happened with your mom, and she's since passed away. It involves a bunch of different things, but I wanted to start. I think the date is January 31st, 2023. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, and so I you eventually got some of the body cam video, and the whole video goes 9 minutes. We won't watch the whole thing, but let's watch a
Actually,
couple.
the date of this video is February 5, 2023, but she was taken twice.
Okay, all right, February 5, 2023. All right,
Yes.
so let's watch.
No. You can say no. He can say no. I can say no.
No, you can't take me.
But at the end of the day, you are going to be going to the hospital.
Well, you can't force me to do that.
We can force you.
I got this. Because I'm black. It's because you're breaking my arm. You're breaking my arm. I don't want to go. You're breaking my arm. You're breaking my arm. I don't want.
Relax.
I'm not.
Take a breath.
I don't need a hospital.
Take a big.
We have to get
My
on the
son.
stretcher.
No, you
Come
don't
on.
have to. No,
Come
don't. No, do not.
You're
Do not.
You're okay. We're not.
No, I'm not going. I'm barefooted.
I know you are.
You're hurting me.
I'm barely touching you.
Saying you're hurting her.
You're
So I
hurting
want that to
me.
be on all the body cam.
It is on all the body camera
And I
footage.
want access to it.
I'm black. That's why.
No, it's not.
You're hurting me.
I am now witnessing them grab my mother. I
no.
have the right to speak under the First Amendment to the Constitution. And they are grabbing my mother by force, and they're pushing her, and she is resisting.
Anything better.
I am.
I'm not going. I don't want to go.
For human rights.
No.
She's yelling, she's screaming, she's squealing. And she better get that piece of paper back. All those pieces of paper. They are taking her out by force. Mom,
Don't
I
do
can't
it.
help
We
you.
have
Help
to.
you.
You don't have a choice, ma'am.
Yes. Why not? No, I don't want to go. Yet. I don't want to go yet. I don't want to go yet. Oh, dear. You don't.
All right, so had your mom committed a crime? Is that why they were doing that?
No, she had not.
Uh, did they give you? I think that's you in the background at one point. The other male voices that you were saying about the First Amendment.
It is me. They threatened to arrest me multiple times if I even spoke to my mother. Not if I interfered, but if I even spoke to my mother.
Did they tell you why your mom was being basically manhandled? Why they were forcing her? And that's her home, right?
That's her home. She was the sole owner, and she and I were the only legal residents of that home.
Did the police, and this is Monroe County in New York, and the local police as well. And they all said they were wearing body cameras, and that's how you got the footage. Am I right?
Yes, about 8 months later, maybe 6 months later, they sent me some of the footage. But you'll notice there were maybe a dozen police officers in and outside our house, and I only got one set of body camera footage from the Monroe County Sheriff's deputies and one set from the local village of Brockport Police.
But it's pretty brazen. They knew they were being recorded on body cam, and they went ahead and brazenly did that to your mom. Now, this is, I think, is this from the same day? This is their incident report. Ena Farley is the mother of Chris Anthony.
Oh, I should point. No, this is from when they kidnapped my mother 5 days before this.
Okay, all right. Now, from the earlier report, let's go through this.
Yes.
They said Ena has dementia and the mental state is deteriorating. Did your mom?
That was false. That was she did have what they call dementia. That's they use that term because it could mean someone who is completely out of it, or it could be someone who has the condition my mother had. She could not remember what happened the day before, but she could remember what happened, that same day. Maybe by the evening, she would forget what happened in the morning. You could have conversations with her. She could reason. I spoke with her either almost every day or every day for years, sometimes about complex topics like the news or my personal life. So
Okay.
the statement that she had dementia is used in a misleading fashion.
Okay.
And she was not deteriorating. There had been no deterioration of her condition until something happened about
Right.
12 days before this,
Hmm.
when a woman was put in my mother's house by my brother, Chris Farley. And then
Hmm.
I noticed that my mother seemed to be more confused than normal. But most people watching the videos of my mother on that day will
Hmm.
say that she seems perfectly of sound mind.
Right. Now, was she under guardianship? No.
No, she was not under a guardianship. There was no temporary guardian. There was no
Mhm.
court case of any kind saying that my mother was not a free person and could make
Mhm.
her own decisions. So
All right.
yeah.
And it says on 2/3/23, Jonathan called 911 claiming that Ena was missing and Ena had been kidnapped by Chris and Anthony. I spoke with Chris and Anthony, and now they are referring to the incident that you have. I spoke with Chris and Anthony, and they stated they were at a hotel with Ena and were setting her up in the nursing home Legacy at Cranberry Landing. I explained to Jonathan that Chris had power of attorney and as Ena healthcare proxy so he can make decisions to put her in a nursing home. John did not understand that was argumentative. The purpose of this report is to document that Ena is not missing. Now, is it, first of all, did your brother have this power of attorney that they're referring to,
Um,
this healthcare proxy?
we have never been able to confirm that. He did present eventually some documents, but the police say on body camera footage that they have
Mm-hmm.
seen no documentation from Chris Farley for either power of attorney or healthcare proxy. I know this because they ask him what
Mm-hmm.
legal authority he has.
Mm-hmm.
And twice he lies to them saying he's the guardian. And then
Mm-hmm.
they ask him a third time and he admits that he is not guardian, but he
Mm-hmm.
then lies again and says that he decides everything that goes on in the house, which he
All
did
right.
not. But
And
if I can answer your question about the power of attorney,
mm-hmm.
even if we believe Chris Farley's claim, he had the power of attorney from 2008 when
Mm-hmm.
my parents were both alive,
Mm-hmm.
both well, and this incident was 2023. And power of attorney does not give you the right to enslave someone, grab them from their house. It doesn't give you
And,
control of
and
their house.
you also told me that in the state of New York, the cops violated another law because they weren't allowed to manhandle your mom. Explain that.
Well, if I can also say about the healthcare proxy,
Yeah.
the
Mm-hmm.
form that Chris Farley eventually presented for the healthcare proxy said that it only comes into force if my mother is terminally ill,
Mm-hmm.
permanently unconscious, or
Mm-hmm.
has a permanent brain injury and will never again regain her ability to express her wishes. So he did not have any authority under that healthcare proxy to grab
Mm-hmm.
my mother. And also under Article 81, the guardianship statute in New York State, you're not
Mm-hmm.
allowed to put someone, at least this is what it says,
Mm-hmm.
in a facility against her will. And she clearly was expressing that this was against her will. And we have
Mm-hmm.
documents from the facility where my mother repeats this, demanding that they set her free, saying that she's their prisoner. Now, the police manhandling her, that was just assault
Mm-hmm.
because my mother was a free person. No
Mm-hmm.
one had declared her to be mentally incompetent, so they had no authority to go into her home
Mm-hmm.
and then tie up her hands and feet, which they do later in the video.
Mm-hmm.
But also in nursing homes in New York State, you're not allowed to tie someone up to restrain them. So it seems strange that they're allowed to tie her up to get her to a facility, but they're not allowed to tie her up in the facility. And the
Okay.
police report that you read from was
Mm-hmm.
inaccurate in a number of respects. One was it falsely stated that police came because they wanted my mother, because they said the family wanted my mother to be in a nursing home, and I did
Mm-hmm.
not want that. There
Mm-hmm.
had never been a single solitary discussion with my brothers, together or individually,
Mm-hmm.
about putting my mother in a nursing home.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I didn't know why they were there the first
Mm-hmm.
day they came. They just
Mm-hmm.
swooped in and then left with her. And
Mm-hmm.
she's on police body camera footage saying, I do not wish to leave my property. She's on police body camera footage saying, I need to talk to my attorney. They never allowed her to do that. She's on police body camera footage saying, please leave my house. And they do
Mm-hmm.
not leave the house. So they are criminally trespassing. This is
What if any documents that they provide you that day?
They provided zero documentation on either occasion. That's why I did not know why they were there. But to answer one of your earlier questions, they came up with different reasons for why they were taking her on February 5, 2023. The one they settled on was that she had to take blood pressure pills that were not in the house. Now, the blood pressure pills were in the house. I'm sitting in the house right now, even though the guardianship judge has given my house to my brother just about a month ago. The pills are on the kitchen table where I left them for 2 years. All of my mother's pills were in the house, and they're still in the house to my left on our kitchen table. So it was another, and I'm saying on police body camera footage, the pills are in the house. So
But
it was a bogus.
even if they weren't, seems like something you just make up to give a reason.
It was, because it never showed up in any document that anyone ever typed up ever again. This excuse
No
about
one is forced to take pills, one, and if pills that you need to take are not in the house, police do not come in by force. And look, your mom is Harvard educated, so are you.
No, she didn't go to Harvard, but yeah.
But you're
Yes,
I think most of all of you guys were well educated. They were treating you like, worse than trash. Am I wrong?
Yes, throughout this entire 2-year process, I have been treated like a criminal, but less people get confused because this was part of the plan of my brother, Chris Farley. It wasn't just me. My attorney, my father's cousin, Jane Farley, tried to see my mother at Cranberry Landing before she became my attorney. And after calling Chris Farley, they told her to leave or they'd call police. And my brother Christopher, we found out later, had created a list of 17 people.
Were you on that list?
I was not on the list. My brother Felipe Farley was not on that list. My mother's younger sister was not on that list. And these are the only people who were allowed to see or even telephone my mother.
Now, let's get to that. So the incident we watched, what was the date again?
February 5, 2023.
And what you see right here is that on February 15th, so less than 2 weeks later, he didn't try, but your brother Chris, that is, had her put into the guardianship system and had her deemed incapacitated. But that happened 10 days later. So number one, go ahead.
I want to correct this. She was actually not declared officially mentally incapacitated until about 10 months later. But Christopher started a guardianship case.
He began the process on February 15th.
Yes.
Do you think it's a coincidence that the cops showed up on February 5 and 10 days later he starts this process?
No. This was part of a plan, but I want to point out that this is documentary evidence of the illegality of it all. You don't kidnap someone first and then start the guardianship against their will. You have them evaluated and then, if necessary, against their will, start a guardianship.
How many law enforcement have you gone to try to get the perpetrators of what looks to be very serious crimes to be held accountable?
I'm thinking probably about 3 or 4 different agencies: the Brockport Village Police, the Monroe County Sheriff's deputies, and then eventually I went to the Attorney General's Office for Police Misconduct. I also just spoke with an FBI agent or someone who claimed to be an FBI agent just now.
And how many people have been arrested and or tried, awaiting trial, or convicted?
0. There have been no charges whatsoever. They will say that they have investigated, but they did not investigate because no one has come to me asking me any questions about my mother, except for this FBI agent that I just spoke with, I guess. No one came to me.
Is this your brother?
That is him, yes. Christopher John.
All right. He has a Wikipedia page. He's a journalist. Obviously, he's a big enough deal to have a Wikipedia page. That doesn't happen. You don't have a Wikipedia page, and you went to Harvard, right? So he's obviously at least kind of a big deal. Do you think that his status in society has anything to do with the fact that this is being covered up?
I think that the fact that he's a reporter and his wife Sharon Epperson is a reporter is maybe the reason why until this calendar year, there have been no newspaper articles about it, despite my contacting local reporters who have covered guardianship issues.
All right,
as far
so
as
start us at the beginning. This starts when a woman somehow entered your mom's home and walked the audience through the two incidents and then what happened after those two incidents. And while you do that, I've got a document that I'm going to scroll through leisurely so people can see the legal process that unfolds as you explain it. So go ahead.
Yeah, so on or after January 19, 2023, a woman named Mary Ho, H-O, was put in my mother's house by my brother Chris Farley. After about 3 days, on January 22nd, 2023, I got a phone call. Actually, it was from Mary Ho, saying
Mhm.
that a family friend of my mother's had tried to visit my mother to pray with her. And Mary Ho would not allow this woman to pray with my mother. And Mary Ho said that the reason was she's not on the list. And so I called up to the friend of my mother's to apologize on behalf of Mary Ho. But I was thinking, what list is it's crazy. The next day, I tried calling the house, but the phone just rang and rang and rang and rang, which it does not normally do. But eventually, my mother called me and said that she's never been as frightened in her life, that she's never felt as stepped on in her life by Mary Ho, who treats her, my mother said, like an idiot dog. And my
Mhm.
mother said she never would have done what Chris had done to her own mother, that her mother had lived in her house till she died. The next day, my mother called me again. And then the next day after that, if I remember correctly, Christopher called me wanting to know the code for our security system, which I did not give him. He later claimed that I did not live in the house, but I have the email from him where he's asking me about vital things about the house, like the code for the
Right,
security system.
right.
So I was living in the house. It's been my address, since 2012, although I did work in another city,
Mhm.
but I regarded this as my house, the place where I'm speaking from right now.
Mhm.
And I'd spent the Christmas vacation with my mother, about 6 weeks, and came back to the house to find out what Mary Ho was doing. She had taken over about half of our house. She had about 50 boxes, 50 boxes in our garage, and she had taken over about 4 rooms. The bedroom where my mother had been sleeping since my father died, my mother had been moved out of and put in another room. In that other room where my mother had been put, Mary Ho had even more of her stuff, 2 gigantic suitcases, each suitcase bigger than any suitcase I had ever attempted to lift in my entire life. And my mother's belongings were strewn on the floor in disarray, which my mother hates.
Mhm.
But that same evening, Christopher came with his 20-year-old son, Dylan Farley,
Mhm.
and um, he, but there was an argument where at one point Dylan Farley was cursing, and my mother tried to put her hand on Dylan Farley's mouth, and he
Mhm.
said, "Don't touch me,"
Mhm.
as if he was going to beat her if she didn't comply, but she did comply.
Mhm.
The next morning, um, uh, Mary Ho, Chris Farley, and his son Dylan Farley all leave, but Mary Ho's belongings are in the house. So the day after that, January 29, 2023, my mother calls Mary Ho and tells her, "Don't return except to remove your belongings. And you can come with sheriff's deputies." We go to a Sergeant Toomey of the sheriff's office and file a report, which the county says they now cannot find. But
Mhm.
2 days later, sheriff deputies come to our house with Mary Ho, my brother Chris Farley, and my other brother Anthony Farley, who had once
Mhm.
told me he had no money for retirement, even though he's an attorney.
Mhm.
And they took my mother. So
Mhm.
2 days after my mother tells this person to leave, it's my mother who's taken. And
And when you say they took your mother, that refers to that police report we looked at on
that referred
January.
to that police
Right,
report that we looked
right.
at. And
Mhm.
obviously, my mother had been kidnapped because she didn't want to leave her home. And so they obviously were physically preventing her from leaving her home. And the
Mhm.
question that remains to be asked is, how did they prevent her from either walking back home if she
Mhm.
was put in a hotel in this town? My mother could walk further than I could, even at age 84.
Mhm.
And how did they prevent her from calling me since she obviously had my telephone number? And
Mhm.
regardless, she had the house telephone number.
Mhm.
She never called.
Mhm.
And then how did they keep her quiet? Did they lock her in a room, Did they post a policeman outside her door? Did they, if they put her in a hotel, did they unplug the phone? All of this would be a crime, a clear crime, but we'll never know. But I happened to guess where my mother might be on February 5, 2023, 5 days after the kidnapping. I had previously spoken to
Now, before you go on, what you're describing later that day, later the same day, what you're about to describe is the events that we watched in the beginning.
Yeah, so on February 5, those are the events that you saw, but what you didn't see, but you can watch on the website enafarleytaken.com is 2 hours beforehand, police are talking with my mother quite calmly. So they tried to play it off and when the guardianship case started in the court evaluator's report that that they talked to me for 2 hours, but they talked to my mother for 2 hours. You see, they had to pretend that if they talk to my mother for 2 hours, then the question is, wait a minute, why are they putting her in a memory care facility if they can have a conversation with her? But you can watch it all on enafarleytaken.com. But after 2 hours, my mother is saying she's happy now. She didn't know who those people were that she was with before. And she's happy now, and she wants to stay in her home under the care and guidance of her son, meaning me. And my brother Felipe, who's an attorney, said that could constitute a revocation of any power of attorney Chris Farley had, or healthcare proxy even, because my mother is saying she wants to be here. At one point, a Deputy Wakefield is even arguing with my mother, saying she has to listen to what Chris says. And my mother says, no, she doesn't, that she makes her own decisions about what medicines she takes. And indeed, they're telling her that she has to take these pills. And it was a long time before they explained that it was blood pressure pills that they wanted her to take. And so we didn't know.
What you're describing, it feels like that's not something that happens in America.
Yes,
Maybe
correct.
in Iran and North Korea, cops show up and tell you better take your pills. Why? Did
Correct.
anyone explain to you under what authority or what power they had to force your mom to take pills?
Yeah, they showed no documents, but at one point, the Sergeant Mazenga, whom I had spoken to 2 days before, he wouldn't tell me where my mother was, nor would he tell me why he was not telling me where my mother was. So again, she's being put in a gulag. And the Sergeant Mazenga shows my mother something on his phone. Now, he doesn't show it to me. So the question is, if he's going to take her because he thinks she's mentally incompetent, then why is he showing her anything?
Right.
But my mother replies saying, that's for idiots. I'm not an idiot. And she's from Jamaica. So when she says idiot, she really means someone with mental problems or an imbecile. So I don't know exactly what he showed her, but regardless, they didn't have any right to take her. There was no court case going on. Contrary to what a Deputy Wakefield says on camera, there had been no court that said my mother could not make any decisions. That was simply a lie.
Well, we saw that, in fact, 10 days later is when they instigated this court process. So obviously it wasn't happening on February 5th. So they had no authority whatsoever, gave you no paperwork.
Correct.
So your mom disappears. What did you do next?
So after that incident, I must have tried searching for lawyers. On February 13, agents of my brother break into my house, which technically is owned by my mother, but we never made the distinction. Only my brother made the distinction. In fact, the reason why I know my brother's son, or believe my brother's son, Dylan, knew about the plot, was that at one point when he was cursing, I said, how dare you curse at me in my own house? And he said, it's not your house, it's your mother's house. Or he said, it's not your house, it's her house.
Right.
And so I had never made that distinction in my entire life before. My mother had never made that distinction in her entire life before. But on February 13, 2023, I did go out to meet an attorney named Samantha Crane. And then when I returned home, I saw that Mary Ho's belongings had been removed, along with a lot of our belongings. So we were robbed, and including stuff that only belonged to me, not even my mother and me. So I changed the locks the next day, and Christopher complained to the judge that I had changed the locks on the house, even though he didn't live in this house. And I changed the locks because they had broken in when I wasn't there. I called police to complain, and you can see that or hear that phone conversation, I believe, on Ena Farley, jan31.com or Ena Farley feb5.com, or perhaps enafarleytaken.com as well. And the police seemed to be fully aware that some people had come into our house when I was not there. And obviously, my mother was not there, and neither one of us was informed. So for some bizarre reason, police were aiding and abetting burglars who were not the legal residents of the house and who were not the owners of the house to steal stuff from our house. And to this day, they do that. They said, I can go to the town court if I wanted to file a complaint.
All right. Now, eventually the guardianship process starts. And what happens to your mom, and how often are you able to visit her? And then what about some of her friends?
I was not able to visit her at all until my brother Christopher. So about 5 weeks after he kidnapped my mother, about 3 weeks after he started the guardianship case, he was named temporary guardian, and then he barred virtually anyone that he thought would help her from seeing or even talking to my mother. So he created this list of 17 people, and only those people on that list were allowed to see or telephone my mother. Any other person, their instructions said you're to go to the you're to tell them you can't give out any information, or if they come in person, you're to see the manager. Including,
and I got a statement from Tony Harkin, who I think you know, and it says, "Hi, Michael. My 78-year-old mother and I knew Ena Farley for more than 40 years, since I was a kid. Yes, we went to visit in Cranberry Landing, which is where she was placed, right, after she was in guardianship. Cranberry Landing, am I right? And they turned us away because we weren't on some approved list. We never saw the list of approved visitors. It seemed very strange to us, the Cranberry Landing. It felt to my mom and I like she was being held in prisoner or something like that. And we never received an explanation of why we could not visit her." Is that, first of all, who's Tony? And is that indicative of what others told you? That were they treated the same way?
Yes, Tony's been my friend since we were both in 5th grade, and now I'm 54. I think I'm 54. I have to think about it. And other people told me that as well. For example, my mother used to go to the local bookstore. Everybody in town knew my mother, and so she could take care of herself. She paid her own bills. And one of the women who worked at the bookstore tried to visit my mother, and she was told she would not be allowed to. And as I said, my father's cousin, who even has the same last name, Jane Farley, tried to visit my mother before she became my attorney, and they threatened to call the police. They said Christopher said she's a distant relative and not to be let in.
All right, so Christopher seems to have a lot of power. Before all of this blew up at the beginning of 2023, how you live with your mother, so you spent a lot of time with her.
Yes.
Christopher, how much time would he spend with her? Felipe, Anthony, how much time did they spend with her?
So Anthony had seen my mother 3 times in 5 years, the third time being when he kidnapped her on January 31st, 2023. The other time before that was in April 2021 when he visited for 1 hour. And then the time before that was my mother's 80th birthday on September 15, 2018, when he stayed for about 2.5 hours and then left. Chris also left after about 2.5 hours. Before the pandemic, Christopher may have visited about once a year. He called during the pandemic when I was living with my mother for 2.5 years, isolating ourselves. Christopher called maybe once every several months, not even once every few months, and the same with Anthony. Felipe had not even been to the county in about 10 years before he came.
To the outside, it looks like there's no logical reason why any of these 3 should have this kind of power over your mom. Am I wrong?
Yeah, they just committed a crime. A lot of times the police would say after they kidnap my mother that it's a family matter. Well, one, it's not a family matter because if the police had not come, my mother would be sitting right next to me right now. She would not have died even, I think. And then secondly, just because you're related to someone does not give you the right to commit a crime against them, assault, kidnapping, false imprisonment. You're not allowed just because you are related. But that's the line that the local police have been giving for
All
2 years.
so this seems very thin. So assuming that you have a fair, equitable process of guardianship, it should reach a positive conclusion. So describe what happened in guardianship.
Yes. So my mother should never have been taken because you don't take someone first and then start the guardianship case.
Right.
Secondly, while she could not remember what happened the day before, I've seen the memory test that they give, or the test for mental incapacity, or some of the common ones. She would have been able to answer every question. Although, as I said, in the 8 or 9 days since Mary Ho was put in our house, I did notice that my mother had sounded more confused than she had, except 2 occasions when she had low blood sugar or when we thought she had low blood sugar. Mary Ho, my mother said, must have drugged her. That's what my mother said around January 30, 2023, that Mary Ho must have drugged her. And indeed, Mary Ho was drugging her. At the very least,
How do you know that?
I know this because on January 27, 2023, Mary Ho tried to give my mother melatonin twice. Most people just think melatonin is an innocuous sleep medicine, but sleep medicines increase the risk of dementia and short-term memory loss by 78% in some demographics. And it was not one of the lists on the list of drugs that my mother took. She took things like, now I've forgotten the list after 2 years, but she took blood pressure medicine, diabetes medication. She took something called Prevagen, an over-the-counter medicine for memory, and then vitamins, vitamin C, that kind of thing. Melatonin was not on the list. And so I was wondering, why is she pressuring my mother to take this thing? And my theory is that if Chris Farley's phones and computers had been seized and searched, maybe they would, this is just speculation, so I'll say allegedly, they would find that he knew that melatonin increased the risk of dementia and memory loss by 78% in my mother's demographic. But so they had no legal authority to do this, but the judge, without ever meeting me, barred me from communicating with my mother. So I was treated like I was some kind of criminal, right? And not only that, the judge evicted me from this house that I'm in right now. Now, the judge had no authority to do that. I had terrible lawyers that I've spent $144,000 on, with the exception of my father's cousin, who's great. But the judge didn't own the house. My brother Chris did not own the house. My mother was the sole owner of the house, and I was the resident of that house.
But was the judge using the authority that now your mom is in guardianship? Chris is the, I don't know, what was he, the guardian? He
was not.
He was not.
He became guardian only about 3 weeks later. Sorry, he never was guardian. He became temporary guardian only about 3 weeks later. And my mother had not been declared mentally incompetent until about 10 months later. All right,
so he's making it seems like this whole thing is out of order, and they're making orders before they get the authority to make the orders. Am I wrong?
I don't know what broad powers judges have. If the judge has no legal authority, if the judge does not have judicial authority, I would say the judge should be arrested, because he isolated my mother, and she was a prisoner. Certainly until my brother was appointed temporary guardian, no one had the legal authority to lock my mother up, which is what the judge did with his orders. But he illegally evicted me from my house. He did not have the authority to do that. I was not subpoenaed. I was not served. I found out about it because my lawyer found out that the judge had said this a week before. And so I foolishly left because I was getting terrible advice from my attorney at the time, Samantha Crane. But I now realize I need not have, because in New York State, if you're a resident of a house, even if someone else owns the house, you can appeal. You've got 90 days. And no, the judge kicked me out immediately. And so I incurred huge costs paying for hotels, thinking that it would all be reversed very quickly, and it never was. Eventually, I got an apartment, which was also an additional expense. But in this case, the trial, I demanded a trial as quickly as possible for guardianship, and they put it off and put it off. One of the reasons they gave for postponing the trial 3 months, even though it's supposed to have been done within 28 days, was that my brother Anthony Farley claimed without any proof that he had a symposium to attend. But he wasn't a party to the case. He called himself a witness. As I said, he saw my mother 3 times in 5 years. So because of one witness, the judge postponed the trial for 3 months. At that point, one of my attorneys, who was actually better than most of them, found that my mother wasn't allowed to be present at the trial, and so the trial should not proceed. So the judge got angry at that and said that he would decide if my mother could attend the trial, and he would only do it by evaluating her himself. And if he found that my mother could not attend the trial, he was going to make me pay my brother's attorney's fees. Now, they have never, ever threatened my brother with sanctions of any kind whatsoever, despite the 130 pages of perjury and fraud to the court that I've collected that my brother perpetrated and his attorney, Miles Zatkowski, perpetrated. I can say that without even saying the word allegedly. I'm absolutely confident.
And I reached out to all your brothers and to his attorney, and none of them got back to me. I'm Mary Holt, and she didn't get back to me either. And I spoke with Mary Whitepick, and so she attended one of the court hearings with you. And what she told me was the judge asked everyone their name and why they were there. And she works with, I think she runs a group that's like an elder advocate group. And she told me she'd never met your mom before. And she was told she had to leave the hearing because she might be a witness, which seemed completely bogus. Obviously, Mary was not going to be a witness. She didn't even know your mom. She was there as an advocate. Do you remember that happening?
Yes. So when the guardianship trial was postponed, my attorneys at the time tried to have a hearing saying Chris should be removed as temporary guardian because he's blocking people from seeing Ena Farley. We now know that this is a violation of the New York State Department of Health's rights of residents of assisted living facilities. It was actually Mary Del Whitepick who told me about this shortly before my mother died. My attorneys never told me about it. The facility obviously knew about this, and they still violated.
And what do you mean it's a violation? What is the violation?
The New York State Department of Health has on its website something that they call the rights of residents of assisted living facilities. This includes the right to see visitors that they want to see, and it says that the facility is not allowed to block visitors that the person wants to see.
All right, so this so-called list and Tony and his mom being blocked violated the New York law, and no one should have been allowed to use the list. And if Tony and his mom wanted to see your mom, and your mom, I'm sure, wanted to see them, they should have been allowed. If you showed up, you should have been allowed. If her sister showed up, they should have been allowed. And she had tons of friends. All of them showed up. They should have been allowed. And this is one of the problems with these corrupt guardianships is they isolate. Obviously, they isolated your mom. They also drugged her. Am I right?
They drugged her, and with drugs that, according to my attorney, they had admitted they were using to curb her aggression. Now, anyone who knows my mother or can surmise how an 84-year-old woman might be knows that she's not aggressive, but of course she may have been angry because they were locking her up against her will. But they used the drug, which actually, according to the FDA, increased the likelihood of death and increased confusion in order to curb what they called her aggression. And so. And as far as I know, she never was taken off any of those drugs. But on July 31st, 2023, about a dozen friends of my mother's and some of my friends too came to the hearing when my attorneys were trying to get Christopher Farley revoked or removed as temporary guardian and other things. They wanted access to my mother's bank records. The judge not only denied access to my mother's bank records, the judge eventually fined me $13,000 because fined me for something my attorney did trying to get my mother's bank records. He fined my attorney $10,000 and he fined me $13,000. The judge claimed he was also doing it because this was frivolous motion practice, he claimed, because we had asked to have my brother removed as temporary guardian. I don't know, more than once. I don't know how many times it was because I wasn't the one doing it. But that's perfectly reasonable when he is preventing you from seeing your mother. What is
that judge's name?
The judge's name is Christopher Chaccio,
And
CIACCIO.
we saw him on the order. Now, so the last time before all of this gets started that you see her is February 5, right?
So the last time I had seen her in person was February 5.
When's
Fortunately,
the next time? When's the next time you saw her?
the next time was September 26th, 2023. What happened was I got a phone call from a man who's, unfortunately, the name escapes me at the moment, but he had the same name as someone who was a supervisor at Cranberry Landing, someone I had met on June 26th, 2023, when I went to Cranberry Landing on my attorney's instruction to try to see my mother, and I was turned away. So that man or someone with that name called me and said my mother was at the hospital. So I went to the hospital and spoke with my mother for 40 minutes. And my friend's mother, Nancy Harkin, also was there. She's 78, or at the time was. And fortunately, my mother looked okay, even though she was in the hospital. And she even wrote, I asked her to write out something, giving me permission to see her, which she did in her own hand. And it was her own words, because she even says things that I wouldn't have said. But after 40 minutes, 6 security guards came and 2 other hospital employees, and they kicked me out. One of the hospital guards poked me in the chest, which technically is assault. And then they kicked out the 78-year-old Mrs. Nancy Harkin. And again, no explanation for that. That's probably never happened, I'm sure, in the history of the hospital. I was dressed probably in the same suit. So if you want to discriminate based on looking like a ragamuffin, I wasn't looking like that. And so that was
when's the next time after that?
So the next time after that was February 16, 2024. So that was 5 months later, because in December 2024, at the guardianship trial,
December 2023, I think you mean.
Yes, thank you for correcting me. In December 19, 2023, my father's cousin managed to argue with the judge to get Christopher Farley's temporary guardianship revoked, which the judge did. He ordered the judge to let me see my mother the next day, but Christopher refused to let me see my mother for another 2 months until his temporary guardianship was officially revoked by a signed order of the judge. Then there were some shenanigans with a guardian for 9 days named Kathy Jacobs. And then my brother Felipe, who had not been in the county for 10 years, flew in from Alaska. And because Christopher was trying to become guardian again, and he never stopped trying to become guardian until my mother died. And Felipe flew in from Alaska, and the judge decided to make Felipe temporary guardian and then guardian. And then I saw my mother the next day.
And what was that visit like?
Well, I'd seen photographs of her even while she was imprisoned at the facility, Cranberry Landing, and she looked like she had aged years in just a few months. But obviously, it was good to see her. As soon as she saw me, she wanted to leave immediately. But unfortunately, at this point, she was a prisoner because she had been given a guardian. Like that was what the order 9 days before had stated, that she now has a guardian. And I was not the guardian. So I couldn't just take her home. But she was in a different facility. It wasn't Cranberry Landing at that point. And Christopher continued to try to become guardian, as I said. At one point, I tried to explain to my mother by showing her the video what had gone on. Although, and then the next day, literally, Christopher or his attorney wrote the judge saying that I had given my mother some sort of aggravation. And I was thinking, does he have a camera in the room? How does he know? How does he know any of this?
But you also said by the second visit in 2024 that you believe the drugs had permanently messed with your mom's head.
Oh, I didn't think it was permanent, but it turned out that she was on the drugs. Felipe Farley used to date Mary Ho, and I was not guardian, so I could not find out anything about her medication or get her off it. And Felipe did not do so. So she stayed on these drugs that Chris Farley's doctors had put my mother on, and those caused confusion. However, in late February, my mother was leading a conversation with Tony Harkin, Tony Harkin's wife, with me, and with my father's cousin, Jane Farley. And But then a few days later, I find out that my mother is back in the hospital,
Mhm.
where
And
she
what
stayed.
what eventually happened to your mom?
Well, eventually they told us she was in the hospital for a high sodium and dehydration. And a friend of mine who's a medical doctor, Ena Farley, told me that the drugs they put her on, because I looked at a patch they'd put on my mother. It wasn't one of the drugs she took before they kidnapped her. And he told
Mhm.
me that that drug causes high sodium and dehydration.
Mhm.
And so, but also something funny happened while she was there. The doctors kept saying that somehow she should be put out of her misery. They didn't use that term,
Mhm.
but it appears that Christopher Farley and Anthony Farley were telling the hospital not to revive her if she had a heart attack.
Mhm.
And so at one point, I'm there arguing with the doctor. My brother Felipe Farley is arguing with the doctor. My cousin Jane Farley, who's a lawyer, is arguing with the doctor. And my other attorney is arguing with the doctor, saying Chris has no authority.
Mhm.
And the
Right.
doctor's saying, well, I don't know who has authority. So
Mhm.
Christopher has this gift,
Mhm.
gift in the German sense, poison, of
Mhm. But
deciding who,
doctors are supposed to be driven by the Hippocratic Oath, first do
yes,
no harm. So
yes.
regardless of who's got authority, you never do the patient any harm.
Well,
Uh,
they were arguing that they didn't know who to listen to. And so it appears that Christopher Farley, I
mhm.
will say allegedly this time, was contacting the hospital,
Mhm.
trying to tell them, to lie to them, saying that he still had this authority that had been revoked.
All
Moreover,
right.
Anthony Farley came to the hospital and at
Mhm.
one point told a hospital employee, she's at peace, referring to my mother, as if she
Mhm.
were a fourth stage cancer patient and not someone who was in the hospital for dehydration and high
And high
sodium.
sodium. And high
But eventually,
sodium.
after a month,
Mhm.
um, my mother did leave the hospital.
Mhm.
And at that point, Felipe decided to take her to South Carolina, where he used to live.
Mhm.
His ex-wife, Lisa Farley, is a medical doctor and was
Mhm.
allowing my mother to live with her. Why did my
Mhm.
mother not come back to her house? Christopher Farley had gotten the judge to sign a court order forbidding my mother from returning to her house. In
Mhm.
fact, forbidding anyone from living in the house except under the direct supervision of the guardian, who
Mhm.
was Felipe Farley, who lived in Alaska. So obviously
Mhm.
he couldn't directly supervise anyone from Alaska.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
Christopher Farley had gotten the judge essentially to write a court order demanding that the house remain empty.
Mhm.
Also, he had gotten the judge to sign a court order saying that, or he had his lawyer submitted documents accusing Felipe of living in the house, which
Mhm.
wouldn't even have been forbidden under the court order.
Mhm.
And Felipe wasn't living in the house. So he kept trying to say that that he should become guardian, that Felipe was this liar. He used the word
Mhm.
liar, if I remember correctly, in his court documents.
Mhm.
And so every month he kept dragging us back to court,
Mhm.
and every hearing had the risk of Chris Farley being named guardian again, named guardian,
Mhm.
until my mother died.
When
And
did
so
she
he
die?
eventually forced the judge, or
Mhm.
he had the judge write a court order demanding that my mother could not even live in the home of a medical doctor, Lisa Farley, Dr. Lisa Farley,
Mhm.
and that my mother had to be put in a memory care facility, which is where my mother eventually died. But
When did she die?
she died, the date of death is listed as August 4, 2024.
All right. So you've told a dramatic story, and I got this up as well. This video has over 1 million views. In fact, we'll give it the exact 1,001,369 views. You've told a dramatic story. Um, how much media before this story, before your interview with me? How much media attention did you get?
Only an article in a free newspaper called the West Side News, and that was just about a month ago.
Mhm.
And
And
then,
this is the article, folks, right now. Doesn't even look up, but if you can see, it does actually say there was
well,
an
well,
article.
well, that's a second article in Social Life magazine, and I don't know why the article is now
Right.
down. I told
The other one you're referring to, your mom was mentioned, but it was actually an article about guardianship reform.
yeah,
This was an article about your mom's case.
yes.
What do you attribute? The video is 1 million views. The story is extremely dramatic beyond what happened on that day. What do you attribute that to? How come no media, no local media, not the New York Times, not CNN, not Fox News, not the local TV stations, no one reached out to you? What
Yeah,
do you
so
attribute that to?
Chris Farley is a fiction writer. He writes he writes fictional novels for a living. He also is a journalist. Right now, I think he works for PBS as some kind of executive. His wife, Sharon Epperson, is a correspondent for CNBC. So if you turn on CNBC, you might very well see Sharon Epperson. I think they use their news connections to make sure that other reporters didn't write a story, but that's only speculation on my part. I think Chris, not I think.
Did
I
you
know
reach out to media?
I reached out many times, and no
what
one got.
happened? What would happen?
So the local reporters, only one of them ever bothered, well, two of them bothered to get back to me. The one of them, as soon as I mentioned a legal case, she said she had to go on TV, and I never heard back from her again. There was one reporter who worked for a publication called Minority Reporter, who said that she had enough to write a story, who said that her editor, whom I'd also spoken with, had approved the story, but she came to one of the hearings, and the judge forced her to give her name, and then there was no article that came out. Incidentally, in that 2023 hearing, all the dozen people were kicked out by the judge as well, if I remember correctly, after being forced to give their name. So it's like it should be one or the other. Either you kick them out,
or you give their
name.
Or give their. And he, as I said, he was coming up with this bogus thing. You might be witnesses. That's total nonsense. All right. I read you went to Harvard, right?
Yes.
And I saw, if you saw the documents, your mom has a PhD. What does she have a PhD in?
In American history.
And your brother Chris went to Harvard, and I think one of your other brothers. So your family doesn't look like the sort of family something like this would happen to. What do you think is happening here?
I think since this nightmare began, that it's actually more common than people realize. So I think this is what pulled the wool over the eyes of the crooked police. I still want them arrested. Everyone in those videos I want arrested, but they probably thought, oh, this doesn't happen. Chris Farley is a son. He wouldn't torture his mother. He wouldn't steal $1 million from his mother, which, again, I don't know that he's stolen $1 million. I do know he's stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars because he caused all of her money to disappear through this court action. And I don't know how much money she had before the court action, which she should have had, according to one person familiar with my parents' salaries, $1 million or more. And yet Christopher claims her estate is in debt now after 18 months after he kidnapped her. But so they might think that children don't do this to their parents, but now I know children do this to their parents. They do this to their siblings, their uncles, and so forth.
But your brother is a fine, upstanding citizen, Harvard educated. You interviewed, I saw Dave Chappelle. You know, he writes fiction. Well, that outwardly doesn't look like the sort of guy that would scheme to hurt his mom and steal from her. And you would, and you're saying his wife works for CNBC. Don't they have enough of their own money? What's happening?
That's why for 8 months I was surprised. Even I did not want to believe for the first 8 months of this nightmare, maybe the first 6 months of this nightmare, that Chris was doing it for the money. Now I am absolutely convinced he's doing it for the money. I'll just give one example. I don't know that this is directly related, but Sharon Epperson, my brother's wife, was sued for $2 million. The month she was sued, Christopher has an appointment for my mother to see a PhD psychologist. Now, nothing had changed with my mother's memory to warrant this, and Chris never told us about this appointment. But 1 month before Chris kidnapped my mother, there was a final settlement in the $2 million lawsuit. So the proximity in time certainly warrants investigation. But I can say definitively, it is almost mathematically impossible for my mother to have as little money as Christopher Farley claims that she had when he kidnapped her, and that the numbers he has given, I can say, I don't even need to use the word alleged, the numbers that Chris Farley has given for the money my mother has have been all over the place with no consistency. Initially, he said that her estate was worth $580,000 in February 2023, $380,000 if you exclude the house. But then literally the next month in the Court of Evaluators report, he says she only has some $230,000 in her bank accounts. And then she still has $197,000 in her bank accounts a year later. But then 10 days before she died, I received documents from my mother's banks saying or suggesting that she had less than $6,100. But
Mhm.
Christopher Farley, after my mother died, said she had $25,000 in her bank account. So the numbers are all over the place. As I said, the judge fined me $13,000 even to get access just to her bank accounts, the records
And
rather.
so what you're describing sounds like you needed to get access. You had good reason that you wanted to see it because the numbers weren't adding up. Am I right?
I didn't even know what the numbers were then because I didn't have
Right.
access. I got this
Right.
information after my mother, starting 10 days before my mother died, and then
Mhm.
after my mother died. But the numbers still don't add up. And also, here's a simple question. If Christopher was working in good faith, why the need for all the lying, the perjury, the
Mhm.
fraud to the court? I don't need to say alleged about the
Mhm.
perjury and fraud to the court that he committed, the lying. I don't need to
Mhm.
say alleged at all. Why the need for that? And also why the need for underhanded things? Like when he started the probate court case after my mother passed away, he did not
Mhm.
inform me of it. I'm one of
Mhm.
my four sons of my parents.
Mhm.
Why did he not inform me?
Mhm.
The obvious answer is that so he could get himself named executor without any opposition.
Mhm.
But if everything is above board, there would be no need to carry out
So,
this kind of
right.
underhanded behavior. And moreover, I don't want to make this about. I don't want to say I'm crying,
Mhm.
but I say this only because it now makes it clear what my brother's motives were. Last month, he had the judge Chaccio restart the guardianship case 6 months after my mother's death,
Mhm. For what reason?
and the judge handed my house, the house I'm in, over to the estate of Ena Farley, which is solely run and controlled by Chris Farley.
Wow.
Even though my mother said on a video before my
Mhm.
mother had been declared mentally incompetent that she wanted me to have her house and all of her physical possessions after she passed away. So
Mhm.
he knows it's not my mother's will
Mhm.
for him to take the house, and he's taking it anyway. He has his own house 350 miles away. He doesn't live in this place.
Mhm.
So the simple question is, so why is he taking the house? If it wasn't
Mhm.
about taking my mother's assets, why is he taking the house? If he doesn't need my mother's money and assets,
Why
then
is it?
why is he taking the house 5 months after her death when he
Right.
knows that she didn't want, that she wanted me to have the house?
Right. Anything else you wanted to add?
No, that was just what I wanted to comment. I want my brother arrested,
Mhm.
and I want all the police and ambulance workers whose names I was never given.
Mhm.
I want them arrested. And there needs to be a full investigation
Mhm.
into why the police took my mother, which the only explanation they gave 4 days after they took her the first time was that my brother wanted to put her in a nursing home and I didn't want that, and so they accompanied him.
Mhm.
Well, I
Mhm.
don't know that police do that kind of thing,
They
or that
don't.
it's their role to do it.
Right.
I want Mary Ho investigated.
Mhm.
What there was a transfer to my mother's accounts, of course now gone, of
Mhm.
$145,815.49
Mhm.
on January 26, 2023. This is 5 days before the kidnapping. My
Mhm.
brother in a court document said the house had the value of $145,900, a difference of $85. So these are probably the same amounts, I'm guessing.
Mhm.
Did my brother try to sell the house to Mary Ho? She said that to the manager of a local hotel that she was closing on a house.
Mhm.
And she said to police on police body camera footage that she was going to take my mother's house.
Mhm.
So uh, my brother did not have the authority to sell my mother's house because only my mother's name and my father's
Mhm.
name were on the deed for the
Yeah.
house at that time. So this was a crime of kidnapping, assault, battery, false imprisonment. They drugged my mother. I don't know what that would be called.
Mhm.
And also
Theft,
fraud to the
embezzlement,
court,
theft,
fraud to
embezzlement.
the court, perjury.
Mhm.
And even though my mother was freed from my brother's direct control,
Mhm.
she died as a result of all that happened, undoubtedly, because she only was allowed to see her house for 1 hour for the rest of
Mhm.
her life after the events of the video that you saw by court order of this judge, spurred on by Chris Farley, not because of what a doctor said. In fact, the
Mhm.
doctor said the opposite. Chris made sure that my mother couldn't even live with a medical doctor, Lisa Farley, who wanted my mother to live with her if my mother couldn't return to this house.
Awful. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.